أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين بسم الله اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. My elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The topic that I've been given to speak about, analysis of Hadith scholarship through time, I think it's a vast and colossal topic to cover in I think I've got an hour, 45 minutes. It's actually impossible to fit everything into that, but I'll try my best to condense it as much as possible and to maybe keep out quite a few of the names and dates that will just, go over our heads and stick to the main content. The importance of this topic arises because we face ourselves at a point where everything that we do in our lives as Muslims hinges on the documentation that was there so many 1400 years ago. The question we face as Muslims is, what does Allah want from us? How do we live our lives? And the only place where the answer to that lies and where how do we emulate the Prophet and the Imams is by charting that history back as to what did they leave us with. So it's very important for us to know that. It's very important for us to chart that history back in order to be able to know what to do today. It's all well and good knowing that we follow fatawa or do taqleed or not, or whatever the case may be, but it's important to know where that came from, where do we get our hadith from, etc. So we'll go through certain terminology. First of all, we hear sunnah and hadith. Obviously, the sunnah that we follow is the sunnah of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, which is their words, their deeds, and their tacit approval. So, and the hadith is basically the narrations of those. So people would narrate, for example, I saw the Prophet doing such and such, or I saw Imam Jafar Sadiq doing such and such. So that's their deeds. Or I heard the Prophet say this. Or somebody did this in the Prophet's presence and he remained silent. So all of this is termed hadith. Other terminology, sunnah, hadith, prophetic practice. You'll hear the terms riwayah, hadith, or khabar. For now, scholars do split hairs over this, what is exactly meant by each one, but for now, they all mean report or narration. And usually, hadith, everything in hadith is broken down into two. There's the sanad or isnad, and there's the matan. So the sanad or isnad is the chain of transmission, how it reached us. So from the person narrating it now to the one who narrated it to him before, to the companion of the Imam, to the Imam himself, from the Prophet, etc. And the matan is the content. Usually, most of the science of hadith hardly ever deals with the actual content. It's always the chain of transmission that's the most important thing, and determining the authenticity is always to do with the chain of transmission, not necessarily the content. The content is looked at if there's very obvious fallacies or very obvious traits of fabrication, etc. So there's that. Now, how did hadith come down to us? The sources of hadith, first of all, we've got oral transmission. The oral transmission was a tradition that was very well grounded in early Islam. So similarly, how the Quran came to be recorded and everything, people would learn it from the Prophet, memorize it, and then orally transmit it to each other. And that was something they had very good memories, and that was the done thing. But that's not to say that written transmission wasn't important or prevalent. It was, and people did write down the hadith of the Prophet during his lifetime. So we've got records of that we had people writing down things in something called sahifas or notebooks. They would write down what the Prophet said. So there's evidence of a sahifa by Abdullah bin Amr bin As, by Hammam ibn Munabbih, by Samra bin Jundab, Jabir ibn Abdullah Ansari, etc. that the Prophet approved of. So, for example, there's one hadith where Abdullah bin Amr bin As says, I was writing down everything that I heard the Prophet saying, but the Quraysh were forbidding me, saying that he's just a mere mortal who speaks in anger as well as pleasure. So I stopped writing, and I mentioned this incident to the Prophet. And he pointed to his mouth with his finger and he said, write, for by the one who has power over my soul, nothing but the truth comes out of it. So the Prophet approved of him writing down. And we've got that. But at the same time, we've got hadith that say that supposedly the Prophet forbade the writing of hadith and that he issued a writing ban. And I mean, we're just going to look at Sunni sources for now. But their sources are replete with a hadith that the Prophet supposedly banned it. But it was actually Umar al-Khattab who banned it and prevented the writing down of hadith for various reasons. First of all, that it would get confused with the writing of the Quran. So some of the companions stated that in the beginning, the writing of the hadith was banned because it would get confused with the Quran. And there are hadith where Umar wanted to write down the practice of the Prophet, but then he remained a whole month asking Allah for the best in this matter about which he had doubts. Then he woke one morning and Allah had determined the course of action for him. So he said, I'd mentioned to you about writing down the Sunnah, and then I remembered that some people from the Ahlul Kitab had written down their Sunnahs from their prophets and then mixed it up with the book. And so I don't want to obscure the book of Allah with anything. So from these kind of hadith, we know that he was exercising his own independent judgment, that there's no mention of the Prophet having forbidden it. And so then he sent an order out to various cities saying that anything that you've written down on the authority of the Prophet, destroy it. There are various such hadith. There's another one where he scolded Ubay ibn Ka'ab for writing down a hadith on the merits of Jerusalem, and he said, I fear that this hadith will become manifest, or the hadith of the Prophet will become manifest. And of course, we've got the famous hadith of the Thursday where he himself prohibited the Prophet from writing down his will, etc. So we have this point of contention that supposedly the Prophet banned the writing of hadith. But if that had been the case, then we wouldn't have had all these manuscripts written by Imam Ali alayhi salam, or Imam Hassan alayhi salam, or Abdullah bin Amr bin As, or any of these people who actually wrote these manuscripts. So there is that. Also, we've got other records. For example, there's a narration where Aisha reports, my father Abu Bakr had collected 500 hadith of the Messenger of Allah, and one day he burnt them all. So there's actual evidence that writing was being done during his lifetime, but that it was later on destroyed. So it's not that it wasn't being done or that it was prohibited. It was actually being written, but then destroyed. Okay. So the earliest hadith records we have, from the Ahlul Sunnah, we've got Ibn Jurayj compiled a work in 150 AH, so that's a good century and a half after the Prophet's death, so it's about a century, yeah, or more. So Ibn Jurayj in Makkah, Al-Awza'i in Sham, Sufyan al-Thawri in Kufa, and other places, and they were all contemporaries. Their Sahih al-Bukhari didn't come until the 3rd century, so it was a good few years. And there was a lot of controversy even when it started to be written down. It was around the time of, it was Umar bin Abdulaziz, the Umayyad Khalif, who allowed it to then be written. As for the recording by the Ahlul Bayt, we know that the situation was completely opposite. From Imam Ali alayhi salam's hadith, he used to write down every single little thing that the Prophet said. Al-Kafi gives us a really good hadith that he quotes in the words of Imam Ali alayhi salam. He said, verily, I was the person who had access to the Prophet at least once every day and once every night when I used to be alone with him. On such occasions, I had the honor of talking to him on whichever subject he was inclined to talk. The companions of the Prophet were aware that to no other person did the Prophet extend such a privilege. Then he continues, on such occasions he would reply to my queries, and when I had exhausted my queries and fell silent, he would himself initiate further discussions. Never was there any case of revelation of any of the verses of the Quran which the Prophet did not recite and dictate to me and which I did not write down with my own hand. He informed me of their meanings, of the abrogative verses, the specific verses, etc. Then the Prophet prayed to Allah to bestow upon me its understanding and its unfailing memory. And ever since the Prophet prayed for me, I never forgot a single verse from the Book of Allah, nor did I forget the knowledge that he had imparted to me and that I had taken down with my own hand. So we know that the first hadith book to be written by the Ahlul Bayt, actual written record, was this book called Kitab Ali. And mention of it has come down to us in the biographical dictionaries and in the volumes of hadith. Apparently it was a large work in scroll form that could be opened and read according to the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt. So we have a hadith where Dhafir ibn Isa al-Sayrafi says, I was with Hakam bin Uyayna at Imam Baqir alayhi salam's house when Hakam began asking him questions, to which Imam Baqir kindly obliged until they differed concerning an issue. So he told his son, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam, he said, "O my son, go and fetch the book of Ali." So he took out a great scroll, opened it and began looking in it until he found the required issue. And he said, "This is Ali's handwriting of the Prophet's dictation." Then he handed it to Al-Hakam, saying, "Wherever you go, right or left, you'll never find any knowledge more thorough than this. With any people upon him Jibreel descended." So a part of this very same dictation has survived until today and has been quoted by Sheikh Saduq in his Amali. And it's got apparently 300 lines or so, and he's narrated it on the authority of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. So that's the earliest record we have of the Prophet's hadith. After that came a period basically between the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam and Imam Hassan Askari alayhi salam, where their companions would write down everything they heard on their authority in their own manuscripts that were termed the 400 usul afterwards, because there were roughly 400 in number. So they would basically write down everything that the Imam would teach them, either on the authority of the Imams directly or on the authority of the companions. Now these manuscripts, they weren't collated or compiled or had any kind of subject index or anything like that. They were simply notes that these students would make in their own handwriting. And there was no attention paid to sequence or classification or anything like that. They were simply notebooks. But after that, they were widely quoted and included in hadith collections. So most of them exist in Al-Barqi's Mahasin, in Al-Kafi, in Man La Yahduruhu Al-Faqih, etc. And more than 200 of them have survived till our time, not as books themselves, obviously, but quoted within these more extensive books. 13 of them exist in the library of Tehran University in manuscript file number 962. And there were also precursors to the larger compiled works that we had. For example, Al-Mahasin, where he compiles quite a lot of these usul in there, but he compiles them in subject order. So he collates them together. And that was, Al-Mahasin was probably the precursor to the 4 canonical works that we have. So the 4 canonical works you've all heard of, I'm sure. Okay, so those were written between the 4th and 5th centuries. So the first one we've got Al-Kafi by Muhammad bin Yaqub al-Kulayni. Let me go through them one by one. So Al-Kafi, what he did basically is he got all these ahadith that existed in his time, and he says in his introduction that his purpose was to make sure that he collected all the hadith known to him that were authentic. So he's included a lot of ahadith from these 400 usul. It's compiled in about 34 books, or 300 books meaning, chapters, but not as long, containing about 16,000 odd ahadith. And he divided it into two parts. So there was usul al-kafi and furu al-kafi. The usul were to do with the principles of tawheed, etc. And the furu were actual applied religious practices. And he compiled it over a period of 20 years. So, as was the case when people were writing down usulis, they would mention the isnad, the chain of transmission. So Kulayni himself quotes the isnad of all these ahadith, but he seems to be less concerned with the isnad than with the actual content. So he's classified it now in subject order and according to content. So you see that he's not meticulous with what kind of isnad that he includes. So sometimes in the isnad there's people who aren't strictly speaking disciples of imams. Sometimes they belong to different persuasions like the Zaydis. Sometimes they're extremists. Some of them are those who regarded that particular imam as the final imam, or there are even people who are entirely unconnected with Shia views. And there are some ahadith that actually end up at non-ma'soom as well, because his aim was to include, because it was in subject order, to include as many different subjects as possible within that. Also, in his treatment of it, he lets the traditions speak for themselves. There's very little by way of commentary on his part. He doesn't intervene very much unless there's an apparent inconsistency or a real discrepancy, but it's very rare. So his task was mainly one of collecting and compiling together. After that came من لا يحضره الفقيه by Sheikh Saduq Ibn Babawayh al-Qumi. That was divided into 4 sections of about 6,000 ahadith. In his work, there's no isnad. So he doesn't mention the chains of transmission because his aim was not there as a scholarly work. He wanted to have a compendium of ahadith for the layman or for the general person who would want to check out the rulings of the time. So he doesn't include the asanid because there were other works there of his which he cross-references in his book. So he says, for example, when he mentions the chapter on Hajj, etc., that for further information you can refer to this such and such book of mine. So the scholars could check the isnads in other books of his. He frequently, as we said, refers to his own work. Another feature is his method. He doesn't let the traditions speak for themselves because he frequently draws from other traditions, he comments on them, he links them together, explains their meaning, etc. And most of them are to do with the furu' and the practices of fiqh. So all in all, it was basically an extremely useful compendium for the ordinary Shia Muslims of the period. And man la yahduru al-faqih, the meaning itself means it's like it's there for someone who doesn't have a faqih at his disposal. So it's like every man his own lawyer, every man his own jurist kind of thing. After that came Tahdhib al-Ahkam by Sheikh Tusi. The Sheikh Tusi his work marks the climax of a very great period in Shia Hadith scholarship. He was a giant of a scholar because his teacher was Sheikh Mufid, Sharif Murtada, Sharif Radi, and so he was a great theologian, a great muhaddith. He laid down great principles of usul al-fiqh, etc. And his works, Al-Mabsut and Nihaya, are still used. So he originally wrote Tahdhib al-Ahkam as a commentary of his teacher's work. So Sheikh Mufid wrote a work called Al-Muqni'ah, and this was his commentary of it. But what he does, he doesn't restrict himself to only the ahadith that Sheikh Mufid quoted, but he goes into greater detail and includes many more ahadith, and he makes it clear in his introduction that he's only going to concern himself with the furu', again, only with Islamic legal rulings and practical regulations. And he also writes in his introduction that his principal motive was to reconcile the differences that were arising in Shia fiqh and in Shia traditions, and because they're being used by their opponents as arguments against them. So he wanted to analyze these different ahadith and reconcile them. So he quotes both weak ahadith or both contradictory ahadith as well as the ones that he used to reconcile them. And what he does is he quotes the ahadith, he mentions Sheikh Mufid's comments on them, and then he mentions his own comments as well on top of that. And then al-istibsar is basically a summary of Tahdhib al-Ahkam. And in that one, again, he uses the same thing, but in al-istibsar he mentions mainly the incongruent ahadith and not so much the ones that reconciles. It's possible to say that Al-Kafi and Tahdhib al-Ahkam are more comprehensive because they include the isnad, they're greater compilations, whereas Man La Yahduru al-Faqih and Al-Istibsar are abridged versions that the layperson could use. Now the main question that arises is, are they all authentic? Are they sahih? These 4 books, is it equivalent to what the Sunnis believe theirs are, like Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Muslim, which weren't sahih anyway, but can we assume that everything in these books is sahih? Well, first of all, to define sahih here is just basically, do they all originate from the ma'soom? Do they have unbroken chains where they've authentically come from a ma'soom? And the main scholar who's gone into a lot of detail into examining whether they're sahih or not was Sayyid al-Khu'i. He did extensive research into them, and simply by looking at what the scholars themselves said about their books in their introductions, he deduces that they're actually not. So from Al-Kafi's introduction, he goes into what Shaykh al-Kulaini says. So he basically asserts that he's tried to include all the ahadith. Actually, he doesn't say he tried. He says he has included everything, but it's according to his own personal judgment. Now, personal judgment can't be used as an authority for anything in deriving rulings. So if I, for example, compiled something and I said, well, I believe everything in here is true, that's my belief. It's not necessarily that everything in there is true. So again, Kulaini says, and Kulaini uses words like, he says, I hope that everything in here is authentic, or my intention was sincere in that everything here is authentic. But at the same time, there was no condition imposed on him that he would restrict himself to only that was authentic, and that there would be nothing inauthentic in it. So he does quote traditions which are from non-ma'sooms, and he does include things, like we said, from the ghulat, which were extremists, or from people who were Zaydis, or etc. Also, there are not unbroken chains. There are chains that we call mursal traditions, which have just been kind of, there might be 1 or 2 companions missing in between, and they've been hurried and said, well, this is from Imam Ja'far Sadiq, alayhi salam. Also, his own contemporaries, his own teacher, Muhammad bin Hassan ibn Walid, and Sheikh Saduq, who came after him, they themselves didn't believe that everything in there was authentic. And so we can quite easily conclude that you can't just take it at face value that just because something is an al-Kafi, it's authentic. Each hadith has to be authenticated separately. Same thing with al-Faqih. Sayyid al-Khu'i examines what Sheikh Saduq's statement says, and for example, he says, I believe that so far as authoritativeness of a tradition is concerned, it's a matter between me and my Lord. And everything in my book has been taken from the famous books whose authenticity is agreed upon and accepted by all. So just because there's a general consensus that such a book is authentic, again, doesn't mean that it is actually authentic. And because he said that this is between me and my Lord, it's something that's not necessarily to be taken as a testimony of authoritative proof. And the same thing goes for Tahdhib and Istibsar. I won't go into it in detail, but Sayyid al-Khu'i basically concludes that the contents from these 4 books are no different from other hadith books, and it's essential that they're subject to the same standards of authentication that any other hadith book would be. Okay. Now, after that came a period where we'd say there was the science of hadith was developed further. So it was not just about compilation, but about authenticating these ahadith as to which ones are authentic, which ones are not, which ones which ones have been fabricated, etc. And the earliest evidence of such hadith-oriented thought that we find is again a statement of Imam Ali alayhi salam. And it's very, very interesting the kind of things he says. Someone comes to him and he says, I've heard from Salman al-Farsi and Miqdad and Abu Dhar al-Ghafari tafsir of the Quran and traditions of the Prophet, which are different from what's known publicly. And he said, and I've heard you confirm what they've been saying to me, but it's different to what people are saying. So he said, are you of the opinion that people would intentionally lie against the Messenger of Allah and interpret the Quran according to their own opinion? So Imam Ali turned towards him and he said, well, as you've raised the question, now you've got to understand the answer. He said, even in the lifetime of the Holy Prophet, people attributed false statements to him to such an extent that he himself stood up and addressed the people. O people, those who attribute false statements to me are in great numbers. Whoever intentionally attributes any false statement to me has taken his seat in hell. Then the people went on attributing false statements to him after his death. So he said, whatever narrations you hear, they come from 4 categories of narrator. So this is Imam Ali alayhi salam speaking way back. He said, the first is a hypocrite who poses as a believer and is actually an artificial Muslim. He does not consider it a sin to attribute false statements to the Prophet, nor does he mind such an attribution. Allah the Almighty has told His Prophet all about the hypocrites and has detailed their characteristics. But such people remained there after the Prophet, and they became intimate with the leaders and misguided people, and hired fabricators and falsehoods and slander, and entrusted them with important jobs and positions. He says, into the second category falls the person who actually heard something from the Prophet, but was unable to retain it in his mind and fell into doubt. So he never intentionally told lies, but he started speaking, practicing, and propagating what he remembered incorrectly and sketchily. The third category is the person who has heard the Prophet ordering something to be done, but then who is unaware that the Prophet later on forbade the same thing. Or he's heard the Prophet forbid something, but is unaware that he later made it permissible. And the fourth and last category is the person who never attributed false statements to the Prophet, and who hates false statements because of his fear of Allah. So from that time, he's already categorized. So it's what were the rudimentary beginnings of Ilm al-Rijal. Ilm al-Rijal is the study of the people who narrated, and which is very, very closely linked to the science of Hadith. So they're very tightly linked. You can't have one without the other. And Imam Ali alayhi salam says it was not necessarily a fact that all the companions of the Prophet had the capability of either asking the Prophet a question or understanding the answer. There were some who used to put a question to him but couldn't fathom the answer, and there were others who couldn't retain it until he'd fully understood it. And there were some Bedouins who'd come to ask him just so they could have an opportunity to be enlightened by his answer. So he says, when you hear the report, comprehend it with a sense of care and not with a sense of narration. For the narrators of knowledge are many, whereas the keepers of it are few. So we see that that's the earliest record that we have of hadith-oriented thought. Fabrication was this big phenomenon that came into our hadith. And there were lots of motives for fabrication, why people would fabricate a hadith. The main one that we know, and that a hadith are replete with, is because of the political motive. We know for a fact that when Muawiyah came to power, he knew that he didn't have a right to the seat of power because he was one of the tulaqa, or the people who had embraced Islam just because it had become the status quo and the whole Umayyad family had to surrender. So their only means was to resort to fabricating a hadith supporting his sovereignty and rule. So we won't go into that in detail, but that was one of the major motives of fabrication. Another one was religious fabrication, where Jewish myths came into Islam, where there were people who'd either converted to Islam. For example, there was 2 famous names, Ka'b al-Ahbar and Wahab ibn Munabbih. There were chief scholars of the Jews, and you'll have heard the term Israeliyat that creeped into our literature, so the legendary Jewish myths or accounts of the Bani Israel that they had got mixed up with our hadith, whether it be intentional or unintentional, but they infiltrated in. Similarly, we had sectarian motives, where the emergence of various sects in Islam led to forgeries by the followers of those sects, because obviously they would want some kind of corroboration or some kind of documentary evidence in favor of their sect that originated somehow from the Prophet, etc. So that would come about. There was also Islamic propagation. There were fabrications made by devout, pious people about the virtues of various merits of the virtues of various chapters of the Quran, where they felt that they would be better equipped to guide others if they had such a hadith. So, for example, there's these scholars heard about a man who had been fabricating traditions about the merits of surahs of the Quran. So they went to him and they said, you know, why did you do such a thing? And he was known to be an ascetic. They said, why did you do such a thing? So he said, I saw people being averse to the Quran, so I wanted to awaken their desire for it. So he was told, but the Prophet said, whoever intentionally lies about me has taken a seat in hell. And he said, but I haven't lied about him, I've lied for him, you know? So they could justify fabricating traditions because to them they were aiding the cause of Islam. Then you had social causes where there were tribal and regional prejudices and rivalries, and you know, this is where a hadith about the virtues of such and such a city or such and such a place came about. You know, the people from Kufa are like this, or the people from, you know, or extolling their own virtues. And also social motives to do with their narrating things in order to gain the favors of the rulers of their time, etc. A link to that was the economic factor, where they would gain monetary gifts from the rulers if they made up traditions. Personal ambition was another one, where an unlearned person would want to be considered a muhaddith because it was something quite prestigious to be a muhaddith and to gain that position. So they would feign scholarship. And we've got an account once when Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Yahya bin Ma'in were praying in a mosque, and a storyteller stood up in front of them and said, Ahmad bin Hanbal and Yahya bin Ma'in narrated to me on the authority of Qatada, on the authority of Anas, on the authority of the Prophet, etc., etc., that whoever says La ilaha illallah, for every word he utters, he creates a bird with a golden beak and feathers of coral, etc., 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 enough to fill 20 pages. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal looked at Yahya bin Ma'in, and they said to each other, have you ever narrated such a thing? And they said, no, we've never heard such a thing, never narrated it. And so the guy, after he finished his story, sat down, waited for, you know, contributions and collected money from people. So they went to him and they said, well, you know, who have you heard this from? And he said, Ahmad bin Hanbal and Yahya bin Ma'in. So he said, well, I'm Yahya bin Ma'in and this is Ahmad bin Hanbal and we've never said such a thing. So he said, well, I've always heard that Yahya bin Ma'in's an idiot, but I've never, you know, but this is the first time it's been proven. And he said, you know, you're speaking as if there's no other Yahya bin Ma'in apart from you. I've written about 17 other Yahya bin Ma'ins, you know. So, you know, you had such people who fabricated things quite brazenly, and, you know, so they would do that. And there were various methods of fabrication as well. They would either take an existing isnad that was whole and unbroken and just stick their own content onto it, or they would find a famous quote from somebody and said, Qala Rasulullah, and stick that on, or they would make up a chain, and, you know, and it would end up at one of the Aimma or the Prophet, etc. And there's lots of works that have been written about these fabricated traditions. One contemporary one that we have is Kitab al-Mawdu'at fil Athar wal Akhbar by Sayyid Hashim Ma'ruf al-Hassani. So this was a huge phenomenon, and most of the science of hadith has been concerned with rooting out these fabricated hadith and finding and excluding them from the books. Now, just quickly, I don't want to bog us down with terminology, but there's some that we do need to know. Basically, all ahadith are divided into two types. There's mutawatir and there's ahad or khabar al-wahid. Basically, mutawatir means that a narration's been narrated so many times with different chains of narration that it's impossible for all these people to have agreed on fabricating them. So basically, they've been narrated so many times through different chains that it's impossible that they would have been fabricated. And its opposite is khabar al-wahid. So it's not necessarily that there's only one narration. There might be 2 or 3, but it doesn't reach that level of certainty that it's impossible to not have been fabricated. And most of our ahadith are actually not mutawatir. So they're the other kind, khabar al-wahid. And by themselves, they're not authoritative, unless they're associated with proofs of their context, that they were definitely from a ma'soom at that time, or you had contextual proof at that time that they came from a ma'soom. You couldn't rely on them by themselves. So initially, these were broken down into mu'tabar, or acceptable, and or sahih and da'if. Okay, so they were either authentic or not authentic. Later on, Ibn Tawus or Allama Hilli, they used 4 categories: sahih, hasan, muwathaq, and da'if. And again, this is nothing to do with the content necessarily, but to do with the chain. So if the chain was unbroken, going from the person who narrates it all the way to a ma'soom, and it had reliable, truthful, accurate people in its chain, who were also imami or Shia, then it was termed sahih. If, for example, it had reliable people, but they weren't all Shia, for example, they were, then it was muwathaq. Or, for example, if they were all reliable, but there was a slight discrepancy in one of the narrators, then it was hasan. But if there were any such discrepancies in someone who was known to be a fabricator or someone who, then it was cast out and it was da'if or weak. There were other classifications to do with the hadith, with the chain itself. I won't go into the Arabic, but they would look into whether the chain was broken, whether it was it connected directly to a ma'soom with no gaps in between, whether there was 1 or 2 generations missing, etc. And they had terms for each of these different types of chains. And so due to this was born the science of hadith, which is called dirayat al-hadith. So after this period, you had various books and various works written on the principles of hadith and how everything was categorized. So some books call it mustalah al-hadith, which means the terminology of hadith. Some call it principles of hadith. And there's various books that have been written. So the oldest record we have is a book by Sheikh al-Mufid called Usul al-Fiqh. And again, he goes into whole categories of report in there. After that, it was his student Sharif al-Murtada who wrote Adhari'a fi Usul al-Sharia. After that, it was Muhaqqiq al-Hilli, etc. And like I promised, I wouldn't go into too many names. But so we have a very strong tradition of these principles of hadith that were developed throughout the centuries. And like we said, hand in hand with that, and the subject matter of all of this was the sanad, not the content of the report itself, because the content could be to do with anything, content from astronomy to rules of wudu to marriage to anything, We have extensive ahadith about every single topic, so it wasn't the matan that they were concerned about, it was the chain of transmission. So connected to that was ilm al-rijal. We have an ayah in the Quran that says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِن جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا إِن تُصِيبُوا قَوْمًا بِجَهَالَةٍ فَتُصْبِحُوا عَلَى مَا فَعَلْتُمْ نَادِمِينَ. That if a wrongdoer comes to you with a report, look carefully into it, lest you harm people in ignorance, then regret what you've done. So this is basically the basis of ilm al-rijal, that it's very important who narrates to you, who brings you news. And if it's somebody who's a wrongdoer or who has wrongdoing qualities within them, then it's very important that you verify that report and not take it at face value. So that is the beginning of ilm al-rijal and where it comes from. And what they would do is they would identify these transmitters of hadith in these huge biographical philosophical dictionaries where they would write down such and such a person is reliable, trustworthy, praised, he has an asl. Remember we said one of those 400 usul. Some of them would even record the time period where they lived in, so they could cross-reference whether narrator A would have met narrator B, or were they contemporaries or not, or is it possible that they would have met if this one was from Kufa and this one was from, Nishapur or something, etc. Some went further into, looking at whose teacher was who, which companions they had frequented, etc., etc. So a whole science of ilm al-rijal came out from that, which is huge. It's massive, and I really don't know much about it. There are people who are a lot more qualified here to go into that at some later time. So after that came the 4 later works. Again, you'll have heard of them. And this was between the 11th and 12th century. So you see there's a huge gap here, where the first 4 works were written in the 4th or 5th century. This was in the 11th and 12th. And there was a great big gap where the science of hadith was being developed at the same time. And other than that, not much was happening. Basically, a lot of commentaries were being written on Al-Kafi, on Man La Yahduru Al-Faqih, etc. Lots and lots of commentaries, but there was nothing new coming forth. And it seemed like they were going round and round in circles. But the 11th and 12th centuries was during the Safavid period in Iran, where the Shia faith became the state religion. So the Shias had a lot more freedom to proliferate their hadith, to be very much more open with the study of hadith. And so it recommenced. And with that came the rise of akhbarism, which I'll go into it just now. But the most prominent fuqaha or muhaddithin that we have is Fayd al-Kashani, Hurr al-Amili, and Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi. So first of all, we've got Al-Wafi by Fayd al-Kashani. Again, this was a massive work, 14 books with about 50,000 ahadith. And his main aim was basically to compile everything that was contained in the 4 earlier books. So from Al-Kafi, Man La Yahduru Al-Faqih, etc., etc., he put it all in this one book called Al-Wafi. And he said, I have tried my best to ensure that no tradition or chain of transmission contained in the 4 books be omitted from this work. And then he reclassified it into various subjects and chapters. After that came Wasa'il al-Shi'a by Al-Hurr al-Amili. Again, he gathered in it all the traditions from the first 4 books and most of the traditions to do with legal rulings from other Shia books. It's got some 70 volumes, and he categorized it into an index, explained their significance, listed useful information on the science reporters, had an extensive appendix, etc. Some people say this is even better than Bihar al-Anwar because it contained both a rarer hadith that wasn't in the 4 books as well as the 4 books, whereas Bihar had things which weren't in the 4 books only. Again, like Al-Kafi, it took him 20 years to compile, contained some 35,000 ahadith. After that, Bihar al-Anwar by Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi. Again, very comprehensive work. And what distinguished this work from the others was that he edited, had annotations, explanations, commentary that wasn't usually found in other books. And after that, you had Mustadrak al-Wasa'il by Mirza Hussain Noori, and that was an amendment of Wasa'il al-Shia. And most of these scholars were, as I mentioned, akhbaris. I'm sure you must have all heard these terms before, akhbari and usuli. Basically, the usulis were those who laid down the principles of hadith, who believed that you could use your independent legal, you could use your judgment, you could use your aql, you could use consensus in deriving legal rulings from their sources. So they didn't take a hadith literally, but derived rulings from them. And the akhbaris were against that. They didn't believe in ijtihad, they didn't believe in that the aql had any position. So they were binded to the 2 weighty things, namely the Quran and the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt. And they felt that the ahadith was the most authoritative source of rulings. And if there were contradictory hadith, or there was a ruling for which there was no hadith, or they didn't understand, they left the matter at that. They didn't actually derive any ruling from it. So that's what they believed. So the sources of law, according to them, was just Quran and Hadith, whereas Usulis believed in Quran, Hadith, reason, and Ijma'. They believed that the 4 books, anything that was contained in the 4 books was Sahih. So unless it was actually, asserted as da'if or asserted as fabricated, you could actually take anything from there and act upon it. They believed that you could act on, like we said, khabar al-wahid, those traditions which the Usulis believed weren't authoritative by themselves. They didn't believe that anybody could do tafsir of the Quran unless it was just the traditions themselves, etc. And that was their main bones of contention with the Usulis. They believed that having differences of opinion in their legal rulings was sinful. They didn't believe that that should be there, whereas according to the Usulis, it was encouraged because it allowed you to question and allowed you to research more. So then the Usulis retorted back and accused their ideology of being illogical. The hadith have to be interpreted in light of their context and in light of that situation, and they can't be followed literally or copied. You can't just copy something that the Imam did just because there's a hadith about it. It's not something that you necessarily imitate because the outputs become illogical or nonsensical. And again, the Akhbaris would retort that only Ma'sooms had the power to deduce rulings. Non-Ma'sooms could not do such a thing. Aql was not enough, etc., etc. By the time it came to about the 13th to 15th century, the Akhbaris were almost obsolete. Wahid al-Bahbahani had revived the Usuli school, re-established the role of reason, and ijtihad as we know it now was starting to become crystallized. I won't go into that in a lot more detail, though there is a lot more to be said. Just briefly on the Orientalist treatment of hadith literature right now, just to throw a couple of names. So basically, from the time that Islam has been studied in the West, you've got personalities like Goldziher, Sharkt, and Yambol, who were of the opinion, who were skeptics. They're of the opinion that all this whole body of ahadith that's come from supposedly from the Prophet or supposedly from the companions weren't actually authentic narrations. They were just reflections of doctrinal and political developments in those first 2 centuries. So they looked mainly at the content. They disregarded the chains and looked mainly at the content and said, well, the content is so incongruous, doesn't make sense. All it gives us is a picture of that time. It's like, having a door handle and kind of reconstructing a whole picture of what the building was like just from the door handle. So they were very, very skeptical. And when they tried to date these ahadith back, they would, Sharkt, for example, would look at the common link in the chain of narration, and he'd say, well, the common link ends here, and that was way after the Prophet's time. So this, there can be no authenticity. Whereas now we've got scholars such as Harold Motzky and Jonathan Brown. Their approach is slightly different, where they're giving much more credence to the chain of transmission itself and using both the chain of transmission as well as the content to kind of reduce that skepticism and give a bit more authority to the ahadith of the Prophet and not the A'imma, because their treatment is very much on Sunni ahadith for now. I don't think there's anybody working on Shia ahadith, so it's really focused on Sunni ahadith scholarship. But these are the main kind of names out there. And hadith scholarship today, there's basically there's us, and then there's two extremes either side. There are still people who are literalists or Ahl al-Hadith or neo-akhbaris who take a hadith literally. There's very few pockets of people, but there are people who act very literally on a hadith. In the Sunni world, it's much more common. Salafists or Wahhabis or, whatever they may be. Not so much in actual movements within the Shia, but they are there. And you've got the Qur'anists who don't believe in a hadith, who refute a hadith, and they rely on various ayahs of the Qur'an. The ones that say, for example, that we've cited this Qur'an as an example for all people, but the human being is argumentative. This is an honorable Qur'an in a protected record. Are you disregarding this hadith? So in what hadith after this will they acknowledge, etc. So they quote certain ayahs of the Qur'an that say that the Qur'an is authoritative all by itself and reject the hadith. And there's some famous Qur'anists out there. You must have heard of, who is there? There's Rashid Khalifa, who'd come out with the whole number 19 theory. There's Maurice Bucaille was a bit of a Qur'anist who he concluded that the hadith was not authoritative. There's Irshad Manji, who also claims she's a Qur'anist, though, etc. So not to go into too much detail, but they basically reject all the hadith. And it's funny because they reject it on principle that it's come down to us through these unreliable chains or unreliable transmissions and through through the mouths of people. But they don't realize that the Qur'an's come down to us in the same way. The Qur'an has also been transmitted to us through chains of transmission, through oral transmissions and written transmissions. There's actually not much difference in the way that both of them have reached us. But again, they argue that the Qur'an is protected by Allah, that it's free from distortion, etc., etc. But they can go round and round in circles. So that's where everything stands today. If there's any questions, I can't say that I've done justice to the topic at all because there's a lot more to be said. There's, but if there's anything that you need to ask.
I was just wondering about Ilm al-Rijal and finding out how authoritative people are and how truthful they are. Doesn't that itself rely on some kind of transmissions on their authoritativeness, because we don't actually, well, other people who are making those judgments don't actually have access to the people that have made these narrations. So how do you kind of overcome that kind of circularity or that kind of initial presumption that you're making, I think?
I don't know that we can. It's only based, they are all based on reports. And again, those reports would be, I guess you could only trust them because at the time they were based on context. Or at the time, it's like the supported Khabar al-Wahid, that at the time there was contextual proofs there that that person had actually hung out with such and such an imam, or at the time so-and-so had corroborated their truthfulness. But now, yeah, it's only reports that we have to go by. But I don't know. What do you say? You know more about this?
Thank you for your thing. If you look at the first 4 books and the later 4 books, the first 4 clearly are at a time when the Persians mostly were not Shia. The second 4 are written as part of the Safavi discourse. Do you find it in the second 4, there is a lot of pro-Persian embellishment in the Hadith, yeah? So if you look at treatment of things like Nowruz and so on, so then the whole question of authenticity becomes a little bit dodgy there.
Yeah, it does. That's why, you have those factors in the... That's why each hadith has to be looked at, individually. There's no way that you can authenticate a whole work and say this is authentic, or, and each hadith has to be looked at by itself, because you've got these factors like, the social factor or the sectarian factor or these regional things that came into play. So I don't think anybody could say that, just because they were written later or they were written at a time when Shiaism was prevalent, that they're necessarily any more authentic than...
One more thing, there's this debate about the matan itself, yeah? Many people say that if the matan doesn't make sense, then the isnad is irrelevant, however solid it is, yeah? Because if the matan itself is against, for example, a clear text or something else, or another proper mutawatir hadith, then really there's no point in splitting hairs over the isnad. So is there anything more on that you have?
See, the only danger is that, for something that doesn't make sense to us, is that we're not kind of imposing our own subjective views on it. But if it's clearly against a mutawatir hadith, then I would have thought that the scholars would, not discard it as not sahih, but in their actual derivation of rulings, prefer the mutawatir over the, over the khabar al-wahid. But usually, if there were such discrepancies, then they would either be kind of written off with the argument of taqiyya, or written off with, or that the imam knew best, But to just write them off that they don't make sense, I guess that's something that, I think it's something that needs a lot more work now, and people are looking into it and looking into the context, and contextualizing a hadith and seeing, well, did they make sense at the time, and do they make sense? And do they make sense in light of the Quran? Again, if everything was to be, thrown against Quranic principles or the literal meaning of the Quran.
Some clarification. You're trying to distinguish between the akhbaris and the usulis. When you talk about wahid hadith and the issue of aql, do you not think that nowadays our fuqahas do not use aql as much? Neither, and also they depend a lot on wahid ahad hadith anyway. So what is the difference? I mean, it has come down to like akhbaris.
Unfortunately, I claim no knowledge of usul al-fiqh, or, I'm not that proficient in how they derive their legal rulings and things like that. But when lecturers quote a hadith left, right, and center, I can say that that's not necessarily a correct thing to do. But as far as I think the role of reason is something that definitely needs going into a bit more. And the role of reason, not necessarily in deciphering the hadith, but way before that, before the actual ijtihad process, I think it does need to be given more credence than what it is being given. But I know there's brother Ali Reza Bojani who's looking into that, and looking forward to seeing what he comes up with, inshallah. But
you referred to these written transmissions that you say date back to, like, Imam Ali, for example. I presume we have no kind of actual kind of surviving copies of these things, and so are they just based on people reporting that these things existed at the time, and how reliable are those hadith in terms of, like, chain and in terms of, I guess, reliability of the people within the chain?
So we've got mention of Kitab Ali, and that's in Amali as-Saduq. I haven't personally looked at the chain myself, so I can't say I know. But yeah, they've been quoted within the 4 books, and they're there. But there's descriptions of it that apparently there's 300 lines of it quoted in. So yeah, it's something I need to go and find out for myself, inshallah. Or if you get there first, then you can tell me.
You talked about the authenticity of hadith. So, what about the validity of the way we do salat and du'as? Aren't they derived from hadith?
Yeah, the du'as, ziyarat, all of these things are derived from hadith. As far as their authenticity, or again, all of them are based on chains of transmission and who narrated from who, etc. Some of them do go back to ma'sumin, and some of them actually don't. So again, it's based on individual du'as and individual ziyarat that we'd have to kind of research.
Aside the question of the Quranic text and its validity till the end of time, we look at hadith, which is clearly more contextual, time-bound, and so on. And we have, of course, a lot of instances where the emphasis on particular hadith has varied. Yeah, let me give you an example. Before the Safavid times, there was a lot of emphasis on getting people buried in Wadi Salihin in Najaf. After Safavid time, when this idea spread to Iran and the number of people wanting to be buried in Wadi Salihin became too big, those hadiths became to be less emphasized and said, your soul will migrate there, you don't need to be physically buried there. And there are many, many instances like that which show you that the hadiths have been adapted to changing times. Yeah. So if you look at the corpus of hadith overall, and to look at changing times, yeah, like now and whatever, do you see that there are significant adaptations of the understanding of hadith, or their sort of what you call core message, yeah, rather than the literal following of a particular hadith? Yeah?
I think in that so your question is there a difference in the way they're understood or whether they're being taken literally?
Both are adaptations to time. So.
Yeah, they are both adaptations to time. I guess it depends on who it is who's doing the understanding and the literal, But I think there's a lot of hadith where the ones that deal with such, with mustahabbat or with things like that, I think are prone to being taken literally and being, because where the ones that they split hairs over and go on and on, Babu Tahara again and again, is, the ones to do with the wajibat and the legal rulings, etc. But these ones, I think, are more prone to be taken literally, etc. But I really wouldn't know.
If there are no questions, we'll end here. Thank you very much, Sister Nazmina. Please recite Salawat.